Great. Well, thank you all for staying to the very end. As was mentioned, we are moving on to the labor economics session, and not nearly as exciting as China-U.S. trade tensions. But one thing labor economists do a lot is that we study gender differentials in things. And today I'd like to talk to you about an aspect of gender differentials in the labor market that perhaps surprisingly has almost been ignored by the research community. And this particular aspect was in fact inspired by a visit that I took to China, and I went to a job center in the city of Shanghai. And as we've already said, this is the practice in job ads when you're advertising for workers of explicitly requesting workers of a particular gender. Now, first thing to say about this is not a specifically Chinese topic. If you go back to the United States before 1974, when it was essentially outlawed, it was commonplace here. So here's an ad from Chicago Tribune in 1962. I don't know how many of these you can see, but the first thing you should notice is that there were separate sections in the help wanted section for men and women. So this is the men page. And within those, you obviously have very explicit requests for reliable married man. Very common also is age limits, men over 40 preferred, and clearly want a driver who's between 21 and 25. Just to get even coverage, this is from the ladies section of the employment section. Here, your job is to attend press parties and act as hostess. The employer has a smartly furnished office. You'll consider a young girl if she has experience. And here's some offices, beautiful offices of very young but successful doctors. And these things are very, very gendered ads. And again, age limits are pretty important. This practice has been gradually phased out in developed countries over time, and surprisingly gradually. It just ended in Austria in 2004. And there's an interesting paper by David Carter and co-authors that's beginning to look at that. And it turns out, was something we just learned relatively recently, that it has been partially phased out in China, starting in 2016. So there was a new advertisement law actually designating some fines for any type of ad, not just job ads, referring to these prohibited characteristics. More importantly, the Ministry of Industry and IT issued a regulation targeted specifically at job boards, saying that if you post a job board, there is a specified fine. And 30% of that fine is paid by the website posting the ad, and 70% is paid by the firm placing the ad. So as a result of that, explicitly gendered ads have largely disappeared from the sort of big national job boards. These are the ones that focus on usually very high-skilled workers, and that's happened partly because some folks have made it their business to go through all the ads and try to find some gendered ads and then publicize them and so on. But I mean, there's still gender requests, but they're a little bit more subtle. There's still some highly, some things that make it very clear what you're looking for. There's no point for example down there. Practice is still widely used in other emerging economy markets. I can say, if you go to computrabajo.com, which is a site that serves about 30 Spanish-speaking countries. Actually, it's down to 20 now. You can find a large number of these gendered ads. And in China, we just lately did some poking around again. These types of ads are still widely used at city-level job boards. So in big cities, this Xiamen is one where they're still used. They're very widely used in all kinds of temporary jobs. A lot of the people advertising there are not big firms or even individuals. And the campus recruitment system still does so as well. Going more broadly, they're supported by Indeed and explicitly supported by this job board in Brazil. So there's some pretty big countries there: Brazil, Portugal, Pakistan, Mexico, and India. And let me just show you a last one. I just downloaded this 2 days ago from Indeed.com, from their Indian site. And again, still people are very clear and usually very just upfront about it. We want a male only for this job and a female only for that job. So, what do we know about these things? We've kind of made it our, myself and some colleagues have made it our project to understand how these ads are used. I think doing so tells us not only about their continued effects in the places that they are used, but it will also tell us about, well, what should we expect to happen when they are banned. So what we're going to focus on in this talk, I'm just going to give you the summary of results from 2 recent papers that we've written. I'm just going to give you the stylized facts. We knew nothing beforehand. How frequently are these ads used? Where are they used? What do firms use them to accomplish? And second, how do these ads actually enter into the recruitment process? I mean, are these, if you say I want a man and a woman applies, do you automatically throw the application in the trash? Or, you know, how hard are these stated preferences? And given, if they're hard, if they have some force, then what do they do to workers' application decisions, right? So maybe what these things are really doing is giving workers information about where their application is likely to be taken seriously and where it is not. So here are the 2 papers that I'm going to talk about. The first one focuses on a correlation between employers' requests for age and for gender that we've seen in so far all the data sets, all the job boards that we've been able to analyze. That's 3 Chinese job boards and 1 Mexican job board. And I've got no time to tell you how we did the research. I'm just going to tell you about results today. So here we have data from 4 job boards. These 3 are Chinese. Everything's from 2010. And they're ordered in terms of declining skill level. So Xiaopin's a big national board, very highly skilled. XMRC serves skilled workers in the local market, labor market of Xiamen. And XMZ-YJS serves low-skilled workers, production workers in manufacturing, that kind of thing. Workers who typically don't even have resumes. So these first result is these gendered ads are widely used, especially at low skill levels. And they're more or less, with maybe this exception here, they're more or less equally balanced towards ads explicitly requesting men and explicitly requesting women. The top of the skill distribution, 10.5% of ads make a gender request. At the bottom of the skill distribution, over 70% of the ads have an explicit gender preference. That negative relationship between skill and the probability of having a gender request turns out is true not just across job boards, as we saw. It's also true in a very detailed way if you look inside the job boards. If the job requests less education, if it requests less experience, or it offers a lower wage, it's more likely to be gendered. The employer is more likely to care explicitly about which gender is going to be inhabiting that job. This is just a graph illustrating that. These are the amount of gender targeting, so ads requesting men plus ads requesting women, as a function of education levels, so less than high school and so on. And I've got the 2 genders split out there, so you can see that actually explicit requests for both genders decline as skill levels rises, and this trend, this negative association, is there on all the data sets. We have some candidate explanations for this, and because time is short, I'll simply say that the 2 most likely ones are, first of all, that, well, what do we mean by a skilled job? We mean it's a job where the individual's idiosyncratic ability or skill matters a lot more. It's much more important to get the best surgeon than it is to get the best cashier, right? So if that's the case, then if you have a pool of applicants, you want to be really sure to get the single best person in a skilled job. In a less skilled job, well, if I can sort through my applications more quickly by picking something that's correlated with performance, I can use these sort of cheap signals, right, to easily sort through a large volume of applications. Result 3, is this about some firms lacking men and some firms lacking women, sort of an employer taste or employer discrimination story? I would argue it's not, because what really matters for which gender that you're asking for, it's the job title. It's not, it's the very detailed occupation, that first line that appears in the job ad. It's very, very common to see the same firm explicitly requesting men for some jobs and women for other jobs. And jobs that are female in some firms tend to be female in other firms, things like front desk receptionists and so on. Result 4, so this is where the title of the paper comes from. It's something we noticed just after staring at the data in all 4 job boards that really jumps out to you because it's so strong. So as I said, many of these job ads also have an age requirement attached to them as well. So let's look at the association between the age and gender requirements. It turns out that if the employer is looking for a young person, in all of our data sets, they're much more likely to be looking for women explicitly. And the opposite is true if they're looking for an older person. So let me just show you those numbers. Again, this is just raw data, and I'll do them one data set at a time. This is the lowest skill level one, so the percentage of jobs that are gendered are very high. Under 25, if you're looking for under 25, the requests for women outnumber requests for men about 1.5 to 1. As you go up the age range, it completely flips. Now requests for men outnumber requests for women by more than 2 to 1, 2.5 to 1. One quick comment, the reason we don't go beyond 45 is the highest age that we look at. The reason we don't go past 45 is nobody ever requests workers over 45 years old in these data sets. So I don't know what that says for me. Here's the same result in the 4 other data sets, and you can see it's just there very strong. This is flipped. Here you got more than 4 to 1 in favor of women, right, at the young ages, and 5 to 1 in favor of men at the old ages. Here, Xiaoping is the national one, serving highly skilled people, so the overall level of gendered ads is lower. But again, age is the age of person they're looking for is a good predictor of the gender that they're looking for. This is also survives a lot of statistical controls. What explains it? So most of this paper is pushing at sort of just trying to understand a little bit more where this is coming from. It's much more correlational than causal, but what we can do, because we have really detailed measures of the duties, these job titles that the employers are looking for, we can code up all the words in the job titles, and we put in a dummy variable for every possible word that appears more than, I think we picked the 500 most common words in the job titles, something like that. What words are associated with requesting men, and what words are requesting with requesting women, and how does that change in the mix of duties with age explain this factor? Turns out that if the ad is looking for women in sort of helping jobs, which this is just 3 words. If you see clerk, assistant, secretary, very high chance they're looking for a woman. That accounts for 27% of this age twist. Customer contact does as well. Front desk is a huge one. Administrative occupations. These are all sort of explaining why firms seem to want, young women. Why do they want older men? Well, part of it is managerial jobs. If the job says I'm looking for a senior manager, very likely it's also going to say I'm looking for a man explicitly. A little bit more on why they're looking for these young women. These requests for young women, this is the XMRC data set in China. Requests for young women are highly correlated with explicit requests for beauty. I don't think I have time to click through that. I have the 10 most common ways to request beauty on this. I'll show you that at the end. Yeah. Okay. And so here again, these are just raw data. the share of ads requesting beauty by sex and age, and this is actually in the Xiaopen data where we have a beauty indicator. If the ad's requesting man, the ad's not very likely to request physical attractiveness. If the ad's requesting women, it is much more likely to request physical attractiveness. And if it's requesting women under the age of 30, almost half of the ads say that we'd like you to be beautiful, we'd like you to be attractive. So, so part of the story turns out to be an explicit employer, search for good-looking young women in certain types of jobs, like front desk assistant, secretary, and so on. Mm-hmm. Here's the same graph in the Mexican data set, the Compi Trabajo. In Mexico, we also have an indicator for whether the ad requested a photograph. We don't have that in China because it's pretty much ubiquitous to put in a photograph, so it doesn't have any additional information. But in Mexico, again, if they want photographs from women much more so than from men, and especially from young women. They want to see what these ladies look like. Okay, so we've accounted for 65% of the age twist with those observables. The rest is kind of left over. And you could count that as unexplained. I think we can say a couple additional things about that. There's some evidence that this part of it, even within a really detailed job category, as we're looking for older workers, our tendency to request women goes down, and our tendency to request men goes up. It appears to have something to do with the employers care very differently about marriage and parenthood among male employees versus female employees. It's a good thing for men to be settled and be married and have kids. And it's not. It's the opposite for women. So here's the evidence in favor of that. Only one of our data sets, it happens to be the Mexican one, do we have information on explicit employer requests for marital status. They're relatively uncommon, as you can see from these numbers, 1.2% of the total. But look at what when you see them, look at what they say. If the ad is requesting men, it's much more likely to be requesting a married person. So among ads requesting men, requests for married people outweigh requests for single people by, let me say 6 to 1, since I can't do the math fast enough. And for women, it's the other way around. If you're looking for women, chances are much higher that you're looking for a single person than for a married person. So that's one piece of evidence. The second piece of evidence comes from China. And what we've done here is we've taken the female share of gendered ads, and the ads that express a gender preference, as a function of age on our 3 job boards. And we've made them comparable because they're very different skill levels. We've re-weighted them to have the same educational mix as the city average at that time, and the Xiamen average at that time. And we've plotted that against, just from the census, the share of women who are still single at every given age. And this is just that same curve with a 2-year lead, the argument being that, well, you're not going to hire somebody who's going to go off and get married within 2 years. So these things kind of coincide, but not really. The share single sort of, leads the change in employer requests for women relative to men. If you redo that and instead put the share who haven't had their first child yet, that's the blue curve, it's beginning to look really good. So we have kind of a natural experiment in China here that we don't have in a lot of other countries. A very large share of 5 minutes. Very large share of Chinese women have their one child in a pretty short age range, basically between 26 and 30. And that is exactly the age range at which employers stop explicitly asking for women in the job ads. So it's circumstantial. The age twist does not coincide with labor force withdrawal. It's not that. Let me move on, because I have only 5 minutes. to the second paper, so I can give you a little bit of a taste of that as well. So, there's only, in one of our data sets, unlike the others, we have, I think, a really nice opportunity. Here, instead of just scraping jobs off the web, we got internal data from the job board, and we were able to get, for a 6-month period, not only all the ads that were posted, but all the resumes who applied to the ads. We have that matched up. And we also have an indicator of which employees got called back. So it's an, you know, an indicator of success in the hiring process. I don't have time to explain how we got that. It's based on the use of the job board's internal messaging system. So what are the questions we're going to ask here are, well, so what? Maybe these requests don't mean anything. They're just like, you know, maybe workers ignore them. Maybe firms really aren't serious about them. Well, how are these gender requests, are they actually reflected in who ends up getting hired for the job? We don't have hired, we have callbacks, so it's close. If they are reflected in who gets hired for the job, well, how? It could happen through 2 processes. It could either be that lots of women apply to men's jobs and get turned down, never get a callback. Or it could be that people just avoid applying to places that request the opposite gender. So we call those 2 processes enforcement and compliance with the employer's request. And I will quickly give you the descriptive results from the paper, and then we'll have to stop. So if an employer requests a man, what are the chances that the person he calls back for an interview is male? In other words, successful job applicants are male. 96.3%. So we call that gender matching. So it appears that what they're asking for is very closely related to who they end up calling back for interviews. Numbers slightly lower for women, but overall about 95% of callbacks to gender job ads are of the requested gender. All right, well, what about this compliance thing? Now let's not, instead of callbacks, let's look at applications. Well, it turns out that there's a lot going on there too. Almost as much, 92.6% of applications to female jobs are female, and a similar number for men. So it looks like one of the big reason why the employers are hiring people of the requested gender is because that's who ends up applying to the job. It's beginning to look like these ads operate through the self-sorting process of the workers. What about enforcement? So there's some interesting issues here about self-selection. You know, what types of people end up applying to jobs requesting the other gender? But the overall descriptive statistics are that there is some enforcement. It is probably less than I might have expected, but I guess my priors were pretty flat right when I started this project. If you're a woman, if you're looking at jobs requesting women, yes, women have an advantage in getting called back to those jobs, but it's only 25%. In jobs requesting men, yes, men have an advantage there. It's considerably bigger in percentage terms. So neither of these is like lexicographic. It's not like you're out if you're the wrong gender, but the penalty for being, quotes, the wrong gender is much higher for women than for men. All right, so then we do a little decomposition. Where does this gender matching come from? Well, the results you've already seen kind of suggest the answer. The main reason, right, in terms of decompositions, why most people who apply, most people who are hired to explicitly female jobs are female, is compliance. The ads self-sort the applications. Enforcement contributes a small amount, and there's an interaction term. I'm actually getting close to the end. Again, a couple of decompositions, and then I'm going to show you just 2 regressions and talk about more causal things. Gender job ads can account for 50 to 6% of gender segregation among successful applicants and 60% of the gender wage gap. But here are the 2 sort of more causal, those are all descriptive results. Here are the 2 more causal results that I'd like to leave you with. So there could be more than one reason that when a job requests men, men tend to apply. It may have nothing to do with the actual, male label in the job. The job description may say, big truck driver who has to lift heavy boxes, right? There could be other aspects of the job ad that communicate to the person which gender that they're looking for. So here we try to control with that, and I think we do pretty well. We can put a fixed effect for each firm interacted with each job title. So in other words, we're just comparing Dell Computers requests for, I don't know, a certain type of program over time. And sometimes they might have not put any gender label on it. Another day they might put a female label on it. Those are the difference that we're studying now. So it's within firm and within detailed type of work. Turns out the effects are still strong and highly statistically significant. Interestingly, it looks to us like these labels are causally directing where people send their resumes. And we did a little bit of digging. So when are these explicit requests sort of most powerful? And at least ex post, it became, it made sense. We did a little machine learning thing to try and sort of figure out if you read all the words in the job ad and you sort of knew what this labor market was like, then would you predict that this is a female job or a male job? Right? And then we controlled for that. Sort of, this is like, if you're a smart machine learner, based on the words in the job title, would you expect the employer's looking for a man or a woman? We hold that constant and we look at some interaction terms. It's when does adding the word male to a job title make the biggest difference in who applies to the job? Mm-hmm. When the words in the job title aren't giving you a very good clue, right? If it's, truck driver, a heavy box truck driver, adding male doesn't do anything to it. If it's HR assistant, it's not nearly so clear. And those are the types of jobs that these things seem to have causal effects. I've gone backwards. Oh yeah, sorry. And then we do the same thing, controlling for these we can now put in requests, we can put in worker fixed effects. So I can look at the same worker who's applying to the same job title, but in some cases that job title is requesting, say, a man, and in some cases, okay, gotta stop, okay. And sometimes requesting a woman, we get causal effects that remain large and statistically significant too. Okay, yeah, if I can have 1 minute to talk about a gendered ad ban, because that recently happened in China and it's happened in about a bunch of other countries. Do our results tell us anything about that? I think they tell us something. They give us tell us something about how these ads work. But there's our results in the cross section are consistent with very different consequences of banning these ads. I could imagine a zero effect if the employers found a workaround. And we've seen this in China actually since the ban's gone in. We use code words that won't be caught by a text searcher and so on. Firms can get around this, and we have evidence of this as well too. There's at least one job board that has eliminated gendered job ads on the site. But on the employer interface, it'll tell you, if you want, we will only show you the ads of this gender, and the workers won't know it, right? So you're just filtering post-application rather than pre-application. You can increase ad targeting, and this is just it's become with the internet. It's become possible to target an ad for anything. Very, very specifically to the demographic of the consumer that you're trying to hire. It turns out some people in the US are trying to do this. And here's an example where they were looking for construction workers, so they used Facebook to target their ad to males of a certain age. So there's ways around it. There's likely to be at least some increase in labor market frictions in the short run. Because, these ads are telling you, don't bother applying here because you're not going to get a job. And when that information is gone, people are going to end up applying to places where they're not wanted more often. So that might be an increase in frictions. On the other hand, it's also possible and likely, maybe in the longer run, that this will reduce gender segregation, especially if the employers start looking at these new applications that they would have seen. And I think especially if the change in the ads signals to workers that it makes sense to acquire skills in a certain type of work, right? I mean, prohibiting gendered job ads is not going to increase the number of male nurses in the short run, as qualifications are set. But once you get rid of those types of ads, it kind of says, hey, it's okay for you to acquire skills in this area because you're in the consideration set. So it might have a beneficial effect in the long run. And I apologize for going over that.
Thank you very much, Peter, for sharing this interesting story on the gender issue in China. As many of us already know that rural-urban migration is one of the main driving forces of China's development and industrialization. And one important feature of the Chinese labor market is the presence of the massive rural to urban migrants. And our second panelist, Sugin Ge, is the associate professor from Virginia Tech. She's going to give us a talk on the assimilation of wages for rural to urban migrants.
Well, while we're putting on the slides on the screen, so again, thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be at this great conference, and also, thank you for everybody to stay, so late, for the last session, last paper. So I'm going to talk about rural to urban migration in China. So this sort of like kind of the first paper I have, like a much larger research agenda. So what I'm really interested in is like thinking about this, large rural to urban migration in China. So it is estimated that more than 200 million people, live and work in places where, other than where they register their hookah. I'll be more specific about what hookah is. And then majority of them are rural to urban migrants, okay? More than 70% of them. And then China's economic growth is characterized by urbanization, industrialization, and globalization. And then this rural to urban migration plays an important role in all aspects. Thinking about people moving from less productive, rural agriculture sector to more productive, exporting, industrial service, urban sectors. So, and what makes it, particularly interesting is, thinking about, we know very little about, these, how these migrants to do. So this is sort of the first paper. I'm just trying to think about, like, say, well, these millions of people move to a city, how do they do in a city, and as compared to, like, local urban workers. So that's a kind of a main question I'm going to investigate today is, is there a convergence in labor earnings between rural migrants and urban workers? So we all know that labor costs have been blowing up, and then this is also related to that discussion, and also like some inequality issues. And then the second objective is to identify some sources of wage growth for these migrant workers. So very briefly, so there's a lot of studies, kind of this assimilation studies. So the previous literature basically finds that there's very speedy, convergence. Meaning, you think about internal migrants or international migrants like immigrants, in the U.S. So when they first, reach their destination, usually they get paid less because of language barrier, information barrier, labor market frictions. But then over time, usually there's rather speedy, integration and assimilation, at least in terms of labor earnings. And is this the case in China? So there's, a lot of studies, sort of look at that, more in a static point of view, whether there's a wage difference between urban and rural, urban residents and migrants. There's evidence that there is a difference, not surprising. But then for this paper, I'm more looking at the dynamics. Like I said, over time, whether you see some catching up, and then what's the long-term profile of these wage differences. And a little bit about the hookah system. So during the central planning regime, so virtually there's no labor mobility, allowed between the rural and urban sectors, which was enforced by this household registration system. Basically, everybody when they were born, so they're either assigned an agricultural or a rural hookah, or a non-agricultural or urban hookah. And then after the economic reform, so this system stayed, but then the labor mobility restrictions were gradually relaxed. So having an agricultural hookah no longer directly, physically restricts rural to urban labor migration, but then it may then have an effect because rural migrants still tend to be treated very differently because their hookah status in terms of access to jobs and social services, social securities, and etc. School, like public school for their kids, all these kind of social welfares. And we also in China we have a very specific definition for migrants. So also like in this paper, so a rural migrant is specifically defined as a person who lives and works in an urban area but has an agricultural hookah. Okay, so I'm looking at this, basically a separation of hookah versus the residents. These are the definition for migrant. So the data I'm using is rural urban migration China RUMIX. So RUMIX data consists of 3 components: an urban household survey, a rural household survey, and the migrant household survey. So I'm going to primarily use the urban household survey and the migrant household survey, but then I talk a little bit about some information from the rural household survey. So the kind of public available data from this RUMIC is the 2008, 2009 waves of the data. So this is what I use in this paper. So the original 2008 migrant household survey and urban household survey sample, they cover about 5,000 migrant urban households. And then I construct 2 samples using this data. So the first sample is what I call a cross-sectional sample. So I basically combine the 2008, 2009 UHS and MHS, and then I look at full-time workers. So most of the workers in China are full-time workers anyway, so that's not an important restriction. And then I'm going to look at their real hourly wage rate in 2008 yuan. So we have information on monthly labor earnings and then also monthly hours. So then, we derive the hourly wage. And then we have about like 11,000 migrant and urban observations in this data set. Okay. So first, just we very quickly look at these the differences. Okay, raw differences. So we see that urban workers get paid much higher, like 70% higher monthly wage, and then migrant workers work much higher hours. Okay, so and then as a result, the hourly wage rate so migrant workers is about half. Okay, $7 versus $14. Yuan per hour, so very low. And then obviously, so the migrant workers also have like some characteristics, which tend to get paid at less. They have average, they're less educated, they're younger, so they're less experienced, and then they're more likely to be males. And then what's also interesting is, and if you look at the kind of sectorial distribution between the migrant workers and urban workers, so here I just look at occupation. So the white color would be like the managers, professionals. The pink color would be like secretary, sales, and then the blue color would be like, say, the manufacturing jobs, construction jobs, whereas self-employed is just self-employed. Okay, and then many of the self-employed is not in the China context. It's not like you think about professionals, freelance in the U.S. They're like street vendors and such. Okay? So what we see is that there's this kind of we see a lot of segregation in the sense that access to certain sectors is very restrictive to migrant workers. So for instance, for the white-collar jobs, so only 3% of migrant workers will land a white-collar job. And then as well as if you look at ownership distribution, so majority of migrant workers will be working in the private sector, so the private sectors, and then they have very little access to the state sector jobs. As well as in terms of like contract types, so they're much more likely to have short-term contract, no contract, and so this is kind of just first pass to look at what's the difference in the data. And then another notion is, I also had a kind of this impression. So, the rural to urban migration in China is considered this floating migration. So floating population. So these are short-term, very temporary, but actually, at least for this cohort of migrants, that's not what we see. Okay? So on average, so these migrant workers have stayed in the cities, for 8 years. Okay? So you see, like actually many of them, almost 30% of them stay in the city for more than 10 years. Okay? Even though majority will be still like kind of, new migrants. And then, to study some of the wage dynamics of the migrant workers themselves, so it requires longitudinal information. But even though the rulemaker's design was designed as a longitudinal survey, but then since we only have 2 years, it's really not much variation. And on top of that, there's a large attrition between 2008 and 2009 because of financial crisis. Okay? So what we did is, the migrant household survey, fortunately, so they have retrospective questions to migrants on their first jobs after migration. So they have like information on, labor, monthly earnings, hours of work, occupation, ownership, and most of these variables we're interested in, we actually have information on the first job. So what I'm gonna do is just construct this sort of a movers panel. So I have information on their first job after immigration, and then their current job either in 2008 or 2009. And then, so for this, little, migrant panel, I have like more than 4,000 individuals. So this is to look at this, kind of wage growth and then, job transition for this migrant panel. So first of all, if you look at, you compare this, migrant panel, the current job characteristics, they are almost the same as the total sample. Okay, so it's selection is that kind of sample selection is not a big, concern here. So what's interesting, what I want to point out is that we do observe a lot of wage growth. Okay, so from 4 yuan to 7 yuan an hour, but then we see very little, sectoral reallocation. Okay. So for instance, like white collar job, 2% to 3%, nothing. Okay. So they have very little access to this, white collar high paid jobs. And then state sector job, again, nothing. Okay. Not much change, so about 10%. Again, so they have stayed in the city for on average 8 years. Okay. It's not a short time. And then the only thing maybe, since they're improving is that, so maybe some job security improvement, so the moving from like short-term no contract job to like, more, permanent jobs. So the framework I'm going to take is very simple. So the study is, primarily descriptive. So the first one is say, well, we see that there's a wage difference, and then we see all these human capital characteristics are very different. So first, let's look at we condition on these observables. What are the wage difference? Okay, and then we just take a very simple mean some type of regression and a control for the characteristics like education experience and some other socioeconomic variables like gender, marital status, and then for some specifications we also control for the sectors. So we look at like across sector wage difference, conditional characteristics, and then within sector wage differences, conditional characteristics. So the coefficient on this MI would be a migrant dummy, will be just capturing the average migrant and urban wage differentials conditional on worker characteristics. Okay, very simple exercise. And then the second regression I'm going to run is that it's well established in the literature. So for these for the migrants, so the experience they have in the destination, city, country, whatever, is the return can be very different from the experience they had back in their home, the origin. Okay? So I introduced this additional variable, what we call year since migration, in the regression. Okay? And then so this little twist, so we have a different interpretation for the coefficient on this migrant dummy. So this, what is this now means is this the conditional, again conditional characteristic or sector affiliation, migrant urban wage differentials when they first arrive in cities. Okay? Because when basically year since migration is equal to 0, so this is the initial difference. So then compare these two, we can sort of get a sense about some dynamics. Okay, so very simple exercise. So this is the first result. Okay? So remember the unconditional difference is about 50%, 49%. Okay? So conditional on the characteristics, so the difference reduced to 37%. Okay? And then many of these differences actually due to the sectoral sorting. So the urban workers get to access these high-paid, white collar job, state-owned center jobs. So also, if you control for these, sectors, so the wage difference, goes down to 25% within sector conditional characteristics difference. Okay. And then the third column, so we control for this year since migration. So what we see is that when they're first in the city, so the wage differential actually was larger. So it's 46% as compared to 37%. And then also it's interesting to look at this coefficient on years since migration. Basically, so initial difference was very large, 46%. So as accumulate more city experience, so this wage difference goes down. Okay? So this has a positive, and significant, coefficient, but then this effect goes down over time. So there's some catch up initially, but then slower and slower. And then you can do a simple calculation. You see that the difference is minimized around like 14 years in the city. Okay? And then in the long run, it persists. Okay? And then, so the last column is simply just a within sector, same story. Okay? So this is kind of the baseline result. Okay? So there's this 49% wage differential, and then conditional characteristics goes down to 37%. Within sector further goes down to 25%, and then we have this sort of the convergence or catch-up story, whether there's assimilation. So initially there's some assimilation evidence, but then there's no full integration or full assimilation in the long run. Okay? So, and then, so the next thing I'm going to show you is that basically I say, well, maybe is it driven by like certain group of migrants? Okay, so we look at like male and female. So the first graph, like male versus female, single versus married, and different education level and different region. Okay, so same story. Okay, and then we also see some like interesting gender difference. Like for instance, so females seem to be able to integrate better than males. Single people seem to do much better than married people. But here single, because single people usually has been staying in the city for a shorter period of time, so there might be a little bit bias there. And then also what's interesting is that the less educated people, so if you look at the initial difference, so the more educated people, so they're relative to urban people that do better, but in terms of integration or like catching up with comparable urban workers, actually the least skilled workers do better. Okay, so they have a larger demand. I think it's like consistent with some of the Peter's previous research. And so this is essentially see, well, this is not driven by the composition, or it just crossable for all types of migrant workers. And then the next question is that, well, it might be just all driven by the functional form because you assume this quadratic form. Okay, so I show you that here I sort of more do like more for each additional year since migration, I estimate the effect separately. Not to look at this, these are the red dots. Okay, so a little more like a non-parametric, and then you see like the profile stays. Okay, so it's not driven by the functional form. Then you get this kind of hump shape. Okay? And then some alternative specifications. So we also allowed for like some different coefficients for worker characteristics. So in the previous specification, we just said, well, we pull the urban and rural together and look at this, return to education, return to experience, assuming that the same for the rural and urban workers. But then in the alternative specification, we allow the different coefficient for these characteristics. So we're trying to explore some of the kind of sources of this wage differentials. Okay? Then also there's this idea that this whether there's a convergence or non-convergence is all driven by cohort effect, because we're essentially looking at a cross-sectional sample. Okay? So we also control for cohort effects, and then we also include age at first migration, because there's also evidence that age at first migration affects how fast you can assimilate in the local labor market. Okay? So this is the result. Okay? So I'm sorry it's a lot of numbers, so I just try to point. Cannot reach the top. So the first one would be, so if we look at the return to the characteristics, so the migrant workers have much lower returns. Okay, both in terms of like say return to education. So the urban workers each additional year return to education is like 8.8%, whereas the rural workers is like 5.2%. Okay? Much lower. Okay? And actually, this is one of the major sources of this wage differential. Okay? And then also there's the second specification control for the sectors. Okay? So the sector premium or the sector also is lower for migrant workers. Okay? And then the third column we control for cohort effect. So cohort effect doesn't really matter. And then The third specification we control for age at first migration. So age at first, age at the first migration matters. Okay. So the younger you migrate, the better you integrate. But then it doesn't affect the big picture. The main picture is still going to be, we're looking at these, these coefficients. Sorry. So it looks a little bit surprising, the first row over there. So we have the migrant coefficient actually is a positive. So this is because we're looking at this reference group. So this is a reference group as the female with 0 years of education, 0 years of experience, and then in the West and all this. So this group actually does not really exist in the data. Okay. But the point is that the least educated people actually do better relative to their urban counterpart. The reason is being the return to education is much lower for migrant workers. Okay? And then, so the second point is I want to make is like these profiles, and again, these coefficient, this interaction between years since migration and the years since migration square is this hump shape. Okay? So let me just show you some simulations. So again, here I just show you some simulations, conditional on some kind of reasonable characteristics. So looking at, allowing for this, differential coefficients on the characteristics, how this urban-rural wage differential will look like over time. Okay? So what we see is the overall profile stay the same. That's the first message. So the gap is minimized between 10 to 15 years, but then in the long run it persists. And then second is the less educated people tend to do better. Again, this is all relative to comparable urban workers, okay, for migrant workers. And then female tend to do better than male, and then single people tend to do better than married people, okay, in terms of this economic integration or assimilation in China. So I think I already said that. I'm going to just skip. Okay. And then some concerns, okay? So then you say, well, is it all driven by return migration, okay? Because I only can follow the people who are, in the city, okay? Because I only observe a cross-section, okay? So we did a little bit of work on that. So, one story is like, is this like a less successful migrants more likely to move back? And then there's some evidence I looked at, we looked at like the rural household survey, and then, picked out those people who, claim that they have migrated before and then now in the rural villages. So they tend to be slightly less educated, okay? And then we also looked at like, their self-reported reason why they go back. And it seems like primarily it's not economic reasons. So they say, well, I need to take care of some family business, or like take care of like kids or elderly in the family. Okay. And then so we did like a little bit of work, and it seems to be pretty robust. But then the subgroup analysis we did also show that at least if the return migration is primarily on the observables, we take care of that. So conditional on these observables, we still observe these this general pattern. And then another concern, of course, is that there's also hookah conversion is difficult, but then people do some people do manage to convert their hookah agricultural to non-agricultural. Okay, so this is I look at all the samples in the urban household survey. So they all have the urban hookah living in the urban area, but then they also report whether they had ever got a hookah conversion. Okay? Unfortunately, I do not know when they converted hookah. Okay? So, and then I compare them, I split sample, I say, well, I look at, people who never had a hookah conversion, basically they were born with the urban hookah, and then people, who had ever converted their hookah for whatever reason, they go to college, got a job, and then convert their hookah, or their land, got purchased by the government and give the hookah, and et cetera, So, and then what I see is that it was striking that you look at the last two columns, they're exactly the same. Okay? So it seems to indicate like these migrant workers, as we define, they don't have the local hookah, they cannot assimilate. Whereas once they give them the hookah, there's for assimilation.
Got it.
Okay? So obviously I'm not talking about any causal effects here, but I provide some suggested evidence. This hookah system may still be the major obstacle for the economic assimilation for the migrants in China. And then I have a last couple of minutes, so I'm gonna just show you another part of the study is like thinking about, well, we see this initial catch up, like migrant workers wage growth, So what are the sources of this wage growth? Okay. So I do a very simple kind of analysis, thinking about the wage difference between current job and the first job, and then it could be because the characteristic changes, especially the over time workers accumulate more city experience, then they may have some sectoral transition. What are the contribution of these in terms of characteristic change, and then what is the contribution in terms of this coefficient change? Basically returns to characteristics change. Okay. Very simple decomposition. So I'm going to look at the price effects, basically changes in returns to characteristics or sector premiums, so those changes in betas. And then the experience effect, basically the rural migrants accumulate more urban work experience. And then the occupation effect, so there's occupational, maybe the mobility, up the occupational ladder. So we don't see anybody really moving to the white collar job, but we do see some people moving from blue collar to pink collar jobs and to self-employment. Okay? And then finally, there's some, thinking about some reallocation effects, they move across different ownership type and then contract types. Okay? And then here's the result. So for all migrants, so majority effects actually is driven by the price effect. Okay? And then followed by the effect of accumulating local experience, and then some effect on occupation transition very small, and then also reallocation effect is very limited. And then in terms of this difference across gender, education, so what we see is that seems again female we say integrate better or faster, seems like they can do a little bit more this occupational transition, maybe moving from the blue color to pink color. And whereas thinking about the price effect is largest for this least educated workers. Okay? So thinking about the globalization and all this industrialization increases demand for these low skilled workers. And so I'm just gonna conclude. So it's a very simple paper, primarily descriptive. So I just want to understand whether how the migrant wage change over time, and relative to themselves and also relative to urban workers. Okay? So what we find is that upon arrival, migrant workers earn substantially less than comparable urban workers, and then this wage gap narrows over time in the first few years at least in the first 10 years. But then over time the wage gap seems to persist. Okay? And then I also provide some suggestive evidence that these institutional discrimination may be related to the hookah system remains a major obstacle for the economic assimilation for the migrant workers in China. So the current work we're working on is really trying to think more about in a causal sense how this hookah system could affect these wage differentials, maybe in terms of say quantity and quality of education decision, and the education choice, and then access to jobs, and then thinking about accumulated of the job specific human capital and etc. But that's kind of ongoing work, and I'll stop here, and thank you very much.
Now let's take questions from the audience. I have several questions, but I will ask after this.
So a question for Peter. So among different industry or sectors, so what's the fraction of this gender, requested jobs, for example, across age? The reason I ask this question is different industry or sector may request the job, for example, brain versus brown, conventional versus unconventional. So that's something I'm very curious about.
Hi, Timothy Wolfbarm. I'm a Master's of Public Administration student here. Regarding the migrant workers, how do the children fare of migrant workers coming in? Are they able to get past the blue collar to maybe white collar jobs? And then for return migrant workers, do we know the proportion of them that are single or married, and how many may have children as well? Thank you.
I do have a question about migration worker, and do you actually, in your data, can you distinguish whether they are actually temporary worker? I mean that actually they do have a family in the original place, and they just themselves just went the other place, just work a couple of years, and then just intend to go back. I mean, can you distinguish in your data so that they would just work temporarily so as to just send remittances?
I believe there's one more question.
Yeah. Okay, so this is also a question about migration. So I'm just thinking that the education obtained in rural areas would be different in terms of quality from education obtained in urban areas. So even if you use the same education, it means different things, which might contribute to persistent differences in labor outcomes. So have you looked into that and any way to control for that?
You can ask one more question and then.
What's the importance of marriage, particularly across hookah?
I'm sorry.
Marriage
Yeah.
between hookah people, so especially males with the local ability to get services, but females coming in from outside and then getting married in the urban area. That could explain the assimilation more rapidly if there were a large number of people getting married. I don't know if it's more than 5 or 10%.
We start from Peter.
So I think I only got one question. Industry and brain versus brawn. It's a very good question. We have much better data on the job title and the occupation that's requested than the industry, although we can control for firm fixed effects. And all that is in there. Concerning brain versus brawn specifically, it's there, but it's a very small part of the story. For example, in one pass, we just went through the data and threw out every possible job that could possibly involve some physical aspect to it. And on the Xiaopin data, that's not very many, and all the same results are still coming through. So, and I guess related to that, the biggest amount of gendering is at very low skill levels. So it could very well be that at low skill levels, the men are getting the strength jobs and women are getting the dexterity jobs. So in that sense, at lower skill levels, our different physical endowments may be playing a role.
So a few questions, great questions, thank you. So the first question about children's education. So I may have missed it, but so in this sample, we look at basic migrants like 16 years and above. So especially we don't want complicated study because regarding education choices. So in the kind of the follow-up study, so we're actually trying to look at the variation in terms of age and first migration to see, because say if a kid migrate to the city at age 8, so he or she might just work at education in the city, and then look at say versus another kid migrate at age 16, they already finished their schooling choices, and how the difference, where the difference come from. Okay, so that's a good question. So and then we have some some variation we could explore in the data, and then regarding the return migration, so. I don't have the numbers top of my head, but I believe the people with who are married and with children are more likely to return. But so again, I don't have the numbers. I don't have exactly the elasticity. And then the second question regarding whether we can distinguish temporary worker versus permanent worker. Unfortunately, the only information we have is years since migration. Basically, when you last when the first time you move into the city. Okay, so we cannot, we can only look at this, how many years they have in the city. Actually, we don't even have information how long they have stayed in this current city. So we only have the information, I said, when they first leave, migrate to the city, and then we have the current, the 2008 or 2009, information. So unfortunately, we are not able to, kind of distinguish, temporary versus permanent migration. But I have looked at the census data. So census data basically, from like 1982, 1990, 2000, 2005. And then in the census, so what they have is that they ask, people whether they have, migrate at least for 5 years. So if I just use that cutoff as like kind of looking at the short-term versus long-term migration, so the trend is that, the migration itself becomes more long-term. Okay? So there are more and more people, stay in the city for at least 5 years. Okay? And then they're also like more like rural to, more like, increasing number of urban to urban migration. But that's, we cannot identify in this cross-sectional data itself. Okay? And then the third question regarding school quality, another great question. So we obviously thought about it, but no, we don't have that information. Okay? So the prior is that, probably, some of this differences in return to education could be just, because the school quality is very different. Because these rural migrants, they come from the villages, so they go to like the local schools, and then the quality is much worse than the city schools. So, but unfortunately, we don't have that information. Okay? And then we could, so one thing what we trying to do is that if we impose some structure, sort of build a model and impose some structure, so we could potentially identify the school quality effect. Because we can look at the human capital investment outcome, and if we build a decision model, and then we saw the quantity, and then we can sort of back out the quality. But that has not been done. Okay? So we cannot directly from the data to tell the school quality difference. So that's a short answer to the question. Okay? And then the last question is about this marriage effect. Okay? So this marriage effect, actually, I'm very interested in this marriage effect. So I'm actually, that's kind of the first thing on the agenda is to look at like this, how the marriage, effect interact with this migration effect. So what we see in the data is that single people seem to do much better, overall. Mm-hmm. But then if you look at like split the sample into like men and women, it's kind of different story. So women actually are more likely to marry a local man. Mm-hmm. So once a woman marries a local man, so they can assimilate at a much faster speed. So that's kind of another twist, and we're trying to, we try to explore. But thank you for the comments.
What others?
Sugin, so you have better is the size of the city actually a matter?
Yes, I've looked at that, so it doesn't really matter. Yeah.
And since we're on the theme of marriage, in the U.S., up until 40 years ago, if you were married, you'd have to give up your job, maybe more like 50, 60. Sure. And so, except if you were in specific jobs. So it becomes very natural to expect that the social norm of women after marriage not having the right of a job would impact even in future years after that social norm goes away. And it strikes me that in some of the countries that you're looking at, that norm could have been there as well, and it may have only more recently gone away and be impacting, in fact, creating some of the results that you found. I'm wondering if you could comment on that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. That's part of the story. And yet one thing puzzles me, because we went and actually looked at, well, what happens to men's and women's labor force participation between the ages of 18 and 45? And starting about 20, there's a gap between the two. Like men are at 90% or women are at 70%. And that just remains constant until their mid-40s, when the women start getting closer to retirement. So these women, at least in China, they're not withdrawing from the labor market, but sort of no one's explicitly inviting them to apply.
Got it.
I think we're out of time. Let's wrap it up. Let's thank again for